Have you ever wondered what really happens behind the palace walls? The whispers, the hidden letters, the decisions that can alter the course of history? Tonight, we're about to dive into one of the most explosive royal revelations of the century. A story so shocking, so unprecedented, that it has rocked the monarchy and left the world questioning everything we thought we knew about Prince Harry and King Charles III. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine this, a family adored by millions, whose every move is scrutinized and celebrated, now fractured in ways that no one outside these walls could have ever predicted. The late Queen Elizabeth II, a figure of grace, duty, and unshakable poise, passed away leaving a kingdom mourning and a son facing truths he never imagined. And at the center of it all is Prince Harry, whose actions in the Queen's final days are now being revealed in ways that have stunned even the most seasoned royal watchers. In the first few hours after the Queen's passing, reports flooded in about who was present, who was absent, and who was making decisions that could affect the entire monarchy. But behind the headlines, behind the polished statements, there were facts, hidden facts, that paint a dramatically different picture. A picture where Harry is not simply a grieving son, but a figure whose choices may have hastened the very moment the nation dreaded. Think about that. The same man who once captured the public's imagination as the young, spirited prince with an infectious smile and a rebellious streak, now faces allegations that strike at the heart of family loyalty and royal duty. It's a narrative full of contradictions, love and resentment, public image and private actions, affection and betrayal. And King Charles III? He's not holding back. In fact, his recent statements have been described by insiders as cold, unflinching, and decisive. There's no sympathy. There's no compromise. And for Harry, the consequences are immediate and monumental. But let's step back for a moment. Before we can fully grasp the gravity of what has happened, we need to understand the tension that has been simmering for years. Because this moment didn't arrive out of nowhere. Prince Harry's story is intertwined with a long history of pressure, expectation, and, yes, rebellion. From childhood, he was the spare, the one who would inevitably be compared to his older brother William, groomed for duty but also encouraged to find his own path. And find his own path he did, sometimes publicly, sometimes privately, sometimes in ways that shocked even the most loyal royal supporters. So what exactly went wrong? How did a prince who seemed destined for charm and heroism become the center of such scandal? The answer lies in a series of choices, some small, some monumental, that now culminate in what many are calling the most dramatic family fallout in modern royal history. And at the center of these choices is a question every viewer must confront. Did Prince Harry knowingly act against the very family he swore to protect? We can start by looking at the final months of Queen Elizabeth's life, a period marked by her continued commitment to duty despite frailty, age, and illness. It was a time that required delicate management, both publicly and privately. The palace, as always, had its protocols, its schedules, and its loyal staff ensuring that the Queen's every wish was respected. But even in these carefully curated moments, cracks appeared. Small tensions, disagreements over visits, over statements, over appearances, which might seem insignificant in isolation, became catalysts for deeper conflict. And Harry was there, or rather, he wasn't, in the moments that mattered most. Sources close to the palace have indicated that Harry's absence, coupled with certain decisions he made in those critical weeks, triggered what some are now calling a chain reaction of events that hastened the Queen's decline. The specifics are shocking, and they challenge decades of carefully constructed narratives about the so-called beloved Duke. Details include private communications with aides, timing of public appearances, and choices about travel and presence that, in hindsight, take on a far more serious significance. And while Harry may have thought he was acting in line with his own conscience or public persona, the reality, as King Charles sees it, was far more damaging. It is important to note that this isn't merely a story of personal conflict. This is about legacy, duty, and the institution of the monarchy itself. King Charles III has long been criticized for being distant or too measured, but in this moment, he has revealed a side of leadership that is uncompromising. Reports indicate that Charles confronted Harry with evidence. Evidence so precise and damning that it left the younger prince speechless. Family insiders describe an encounter of monumental tension, where words were carefully chosen, and where the weight of history hung in the balance. And yet, despite all of this, public perception remains divided. Millions of people still see Harry as the charming, misunderstood prince, a victim of circumstance and media scrutiny. But the evidence now emerging, the documents, the timelines, the insider accounts, paints a picture that is far more complex. It's a story of ambition, recklessness, and perhaps even reckoning. And it's not just about what Harry did or didn't do. It's about how those actions reverberated through the highest echelons of the royal family, ultimately leading to his unprecedented banishment. Now, you might be asking, what does it mean to be banished from the royal family? To lose not only status and privilege, but also the tacit protection that comes with being part of this institution? This is not a matter of mere titles. It is about exclusion from every facet of royal influence, financial security, and public representation. And in Harry's case, King Charles's actions send a clear message. Loyalty to family and duty is paramount, and deviation carries consequences that cannot be ignored. But here's the twist. The story doesn't end with banishment. In fact, some of the most shocking revelations are yet to come. Because as we dig deeper, we uncover layers of secrecy, of private conversations leaked to the wrong people, of choices that had ripple effects far beyond the palace walls. Each revelation challenges what we thought we knew, turning assumptions on their head, and forcing us to question whether loyalty and duty are concepts that can survive in the modern royal era. As we continue through this exposé, you will hear about meetings held behind closed doors, letters exchanged in secrecy, and the timing of actions that, together, paint a portrait of a family under strain like never before. We'll explore the historical context, comparing Harry's decisions to past royal conflicts, and we'll analyze how King Charles's leadership is shaping the monarchy in real time. And here's the most compelling question of all. Could this moment, Harry's banishment, the exposure of his actions, and the public fallout, define the future of the British monarchy itself? Could it alter succession, public perception, and even the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II? These are not abstract questions. They are the reality of a family whose personal choices are intertwined with national history, and whose private struggles are now visible to the entire world. By the end of this story, you will understand why King Charles III made the choices he did, why he confronted his son with such severity, and why Harry now faces a path that may be irrevocably altered. You will witness the interplay of love, betrayal, duty, and ambition in a narrative that is as dramatic as any fictional tale, yet it is entirely real. And as we begin this journey, I ask you to consider one thing. When power, family, and legacy collide, can any individual truly act without consequence? Because in this story, the consequences are not just personal, they are historical. And what comes next, the revelations, the confrontations, the evidence, will leave you questioning not only Prince Harry's legacy, but also the very nature of loyalty, duty, and justice within the monarchy. Have you ever watched a relationship fall apart so completely that it feels impossible to repair? That's exactly what happened between King Charles III and his youngest son, Prince Harry. What makes it even more shocking is that this rift didn't happen overnight. It didn't start with a single outburst or one reckless decision. It had been brewing for years, hidden beneath public smiles, carefully worded statements, and media-friendly appearances. But by the time Queen Elizabeth was on her final days, the fracture had widened into a chasm no reconciliation could bridge. Think about the early years. Harry, the second son, grew up in the shadow of Prince William, always measured against a standard he could never quite define for himself. Yet there was a bond with Charles, a relationship built on guidance, expectation, and, occasionally, warmth. Royal insiders often described moments where father and son shared private jokes, confidences that were never meant to leave the palace walls. But even then, cracks appeared. Disagreements over schooling, military service, and personal choices hinted that Harry's desire for independence might collide with Charles's vision of royal duty. And collide it did. Over time, the differences became more than personal preferences. They became philosophical. Charles represents the institution, the legacy, and the unbroken chain of monarchy. Harry represents a modern challenge. A desire for autonomy, for a life outside tradition, for public identity over inherited responsibility. On paper, it might seem like a simple conflict of personality. In reality, it's the clash of eras, values, and power. By the time Queen Elizabeth's health began to visibly decline, Harry and Charles's relationship was already strained. According to insiders, arguments had escalated beyond private discussions. What once might have been whispered disagreements in corridors turned into direct confrontations, sometimes heated, sometimes silent, but charged with tension. The palace staff, long trained to maintain discretion, began noticing changes in Harry's demeanor, a mix of defiance, frustration, and, increasingly, distance. Some of the earliest indicators came from seemingly small moments. For instance, there were reports that Harry frequently resisted attending certain royal functions, citing personal projects or privacy concerns. While the public viewed these absences as harmless, Charles reportedly saw them as a sign of disrespect, a deliberate choice to prioritize self over family. And every absence, every missed event, was magnified by the media, creating a feedback loop of tension, misperception, and resentment. But what truly escalated matters was a series of private decisions Harry made that were later revealed to have significant consequences. Documents obtained by insiders suggest that he bypassed established palace protocols, engaged in confidential communications without approval, and made commitments that contradicted the careful planning of the royal household. These may have seemed minor at the time: emails, phone calls, travel plans. But in the tightly controlled world of monarchy, even small deviations can have ripple effects. And in this case, the ripple grew into a tidal wave. Emotionally, the divide was devastating. Charles, who had always viewed himself as a mentor and protector, found his guidance rejected or ignored. Harry, who felt misunderstood and constrained, perceived the monarchy as an obstacle to his personal freedom. Each side felt justified, each side felt wronged. And the tension only intensified as public scrutiny grew. Every interview, every appearance, every headline seemed to push the father and son further apart. By the weeks leading up to the Queen's passing, the conflict had reached a boiling point. Accounts from palace insiders describe an atmosphere thick with unspoken accusations and barely contained anger. Charles reportedly attempted multiple interventions, seeking reconciliation, mediation, and compromise. But Harry resisted. He wanted distance, independence, and autonomy, and he was willing to risk public perception, family unity, and perhaps even tradition to achieve it. Then came the moment that changed everything. During what would become one of the most critical periods in the monarchy's recent history, Harry made a series of choices that insiders now describe as irreversible. He refused to be present for crucial family discussions, delayed communications with aides, and appeared publicly in ways that conflicted with Charles's strategic priorities for the Queen's final days. These weren't just minor infractions. They were actions that created real consequences for both the family and the institution. What's fascinating and shocking is the duality of Harry's position. On one hand, he was grieving, navigating personal pressures, and attempting to define himself outside the strict confines of royal life. On the other hand, his decisions were being interpreted as reckless, self-centered, and even harmful to the Queen's well-being. It's a contradiction that has left historians and royal commentators divided. Was Harry acting out of emotional strain, or were there deeper motivations at play? Adding fuel to the fire were the leaks. Certain aides and insiders, frustrated with Harry's choices, began sharing details with journalists. Stories of absence, disregard for protocol, and private disagreements became public knowledge. Headlines painted Harry as distant, disloyal, and difficult, but insiders argue that the truth was far more nuanced. In reality, Harry's defiance was both personal rebellion and a misguided attempt at independence, yet the narrative framed him as culpable in ways he may not have anticipated. And Charles? The king observed all of this with the perspective of decades of royal experience. He understood the stakes, not just for his family, but for the monarchy itself. To him, Harry's actions were more than personal affronts. they threatened the legacy his mother spent decades building. And in the weeks leading up to the Queen's death, the tension reached a crescendo. There were confrontations, terse phone calls, and urgent discussions with advisors about how to manage a son whose actions could have far-reaching consequences. Emotionally, it was a storm. Charles was dealing with grief, duty, and the weight of expectation, while Harry wrestled with identity, public perception, and personal freedom. Every choice, every word, every absence was loaded with meaning. And in this complex web of emotion and obligation, the lines between intention and consequence blurred. What might have been harmless in another family became a matter of national and historical significance. By the time the Queen's final days arrived, the father-son relationship was not merely strained, it was fractured. Insiders described moments of cold distance, tense silences, and private confrontations where harsh words were exchanged. The warmth of former years had vanished, replaced by a mix of anger, resentment, and unspoken accusations. And as Charles prepared to step into the role of king, he knew that Harry's actions, deliberate or not, had contributed to a crisis that would define the monarchy for years to come. This chapter of the story is critical, not just because of what Harry did, but because of what it reveals about family dynamics, duty, and the human cost of royal life. It exposes the tension between personal desire and institutional obligation, between private loyalty and public expectation. And it sets the stage for what comes next, the dramatic confrontations, the revelations, and the consequences that would ultimately lead to Harry's unprecedented banishment. So ask yourself, can a son truly act independently without jeopardizing everything his family stands for? And when those actions clash with duty and legacy, who bears the responsibility? The father, the son, or history itself? These are questions that every royal watcher, historian, and member of the public is now grappling with. But what came next? The private confrontations, the evidence, the revelations, would push this rift to an entirely new level. And no one could have predicted just how far it would go. What would you do if every move you made was scrutinized, judged, and reported? Imagine living under a microscope where even the smallest choice can make headlines and reshape public opinion. For Prince Harry, this was not imagination, it was reality. And in the weeks leading up to the Queen's final days, insiders reveal that Harry made a series of secret moves behind palace walls that would shock even the most seasoned royal watchers. At first glance, they seemed innocuous. Emails sent late at night, phone calls to advisors, private meetings with friends and associates outside the palace. But in a family where every communication is tracked, every decision layered with protocol, these actions were dangerous. Some aides quietly warned that Harry's choices could lead to miscommunication, conflict, and even unintended consequences. Others feared that his desire for autonomy might spiral into outright defiance. One of the most significant moves involved a series of private communications Harry had with external advisors. These were not the standard royal aides or secretaries who managed correspondence and schedules. These were trusted confidants, friends, and some business associates who had influence and insight, but no official role in the monarchy. According to insiders, Harry bypassed official channels, sending messages and making decisions without informing the palace. While he may have believed he was protecting his privacy or taking initiative, the results were far from benign. The impact of these secret moves became apparent almost immediately. For one, certain logistical arrangements for the Queen's final weeks were disrupted. Timing of visits, security details, and even communication schedules were altered because of conflicting instructions from Harry. Aides described moments of confusion, frustration, and even panic. A sharp contrast to the normally precise, methodical management the palace is known for. And in the royal world, confusion can have ripple effects that reach far beyond the immediate situation. But perhaps the most controversial of Harry's secret moves was his decision to engage with the media, indirectly, but strategically. He reportedly shared information with journalists through intermediaries, ensuring that certain narratives about his independence, struggles, or viewpoints reached the public. Some of these communications painted him as a grieving, misunderstood son trying to carve out a personal identity. Others suggested discontent with palace protocol, fueling speculation about tension and division. What's critical to understand is how these choices intersected with timing. During the Queen's final days, every message mattered. Every public statement or private communication could influence decisions about visits, family presence, and ceremonial protocol. Harry's secrecy created uncertainty, forcing the king and senior advisors to respond, adapt, and sometimes override the prince's directives. It wasn't just a matter of etiquette, it was about control, influence, and the perception of loyalty. And yet, in his mind, Harry may have believed he was doing the right thing. In interviews and later statements, he emphasized autonomy, personal growth, and mental health as guiding principles. And yet, in his mind, Harry may have believed he was doing the right thing. In interviews and later statements, he emphasized autonomy, personal growth, and mental health as guiding principles. But autonomy in the context of the monarchy is a tricky proposition. Every action carries consequences, not just for oneself, but for the family and the institution. By acting outside the established chain of command, Harry inadvertently challenged not just Charles's authority, but also the legacy of his mother's decades of careful governance. What insiders reveal next is even more shocking. Harry apparently had meetings with individuals who had no formal role in the monarchy, but possessed influence in global media and business circles. Some were consultants, others were friends with political connections, and a few were advisors he trusted from his military service. These meetings weren't reported to the palace, yet they contained discussions that overlapped with key decisions about public appearances, charitable events, and even the scheduling of family visits. In other words, Harry was essentially creating an unofficial power network, one that could operate independently of the palace, and one that threatened to override official decisions. The secrecy extended beyond communications and meetings. Harry reportedly began planning trips and appearances without informing senior staff. Some were minor events, but others coincided with critical moments in the Queen's final weeks. Imagine the palace's perspective. The most important figure in British history is in her last days. Yet one of her sons is orchestrating movements outside of agreed-upon schedules, leaving aides scrambling to ensure nothing disrupts protocol. The tension was palpable. Staff describe hushed conversations, urgent phone calls, and moments of near panic as they tried to reconcile Harry's independent actions with palace needs. And then there was the question of timing and symbolism. In the monarchy, symbolism is everything. A prince appearing in the wrong place, at the wrong time, or engaging with media in a particular way can send signals of disloyalty, disinterest, or defiance. Harry's secretive approach, while perhaps intended to safeguard personal autonomy, was interpreted as undermining the family's image at a critical juncture. Public perception matters enormously, and the palace feared that Harry's moves could fuel negative narratives, erode public trust, and overshadow the Queen's final days. It's important to pause and consider Harry's mindset. From his perspective, these secret actions may have been motivated by frustration, the desire to maintain privacy, and a need to assert independence. But from Charles's perspective, these same moves looked reckless, disloyal, and, in some cases, damaging to the monarchy itself. This clash of perspective, personal freedom versus institutional duty, set the stage for the dramatic confrontations that would follow. And the consequences didn't stop with confusion or miscommunication. Some insiders suggest that Harry's actions indirectly accelerated decisions that might have otherwise unfolded more gradually. By diverting attention, creating uncertainty, and bypassing protocol, he forced Charles and senior advisors into reactive positions. In high-stakes royal decision-making, reaction often comes with risk, and risk can lead to mistakes, delays, and, ultimately, strained relationships. It's also worth noting that these secret moves weren't entirely about power or media influence. Emotional undercurrents played a massive role. Harry, according to accounts from close confidants, felt misunderstood, constrained, and judged. He wanted to assert identity, maintain privacy, and protect his family from scrutiny. Yet, paradoxically, the very secrecy he sought became a source of tension, conflict, and ultimately, public scandal. The irony is stark. In seeking autonomy, he inadvertently amplified the drama he tried to avoid. One particularly revealing incident involved a private meeting with senior staff members. where Harry attempted to explain his decisions. The conversation, insiders say, began politely but quickly escalated. Tensions flared over timing, communication, and adherence to protocol. According to multiple accounts, Harry believed he was acting in good faith, but the responses from advisors were sharp and unyielding. What was intended as clarification became a confrontation, leaving both sides frustrated, anxious, and even more divided. And while this is all happening behind palace walls, the media narrative is evolving in real time. Even subtle leaks about Harry's private communications or independent meetings were amplified, creating a public perception that he was detached, rebellious, and possibly complicit in undermining the monarchy. Every headline, every tweet, every opinion piece layered additional pressure on the family, intensifying existing tensions and making reconciliation even more challenging. What makes these revelations particularly striking is the scale and audacity of Harry's actions. It wasn't just one or two minor deviations. It was a pattern of secrecy, independence, and strategic maneuvering. The cumulative effect? A palace under strain, a monarch forced to make rapid, high-stakes decisions, and a son increasingly isolated both publicly and privately. By the time Queen Elizabeth's final days arrived, Harry's secret moves had already set in motion consequences that would reverberate for years. Communications were tense, schedules were precarious, and every decision carried extraordinary weight. For Charles, the realization was sobering. His son's actions, deliberate or not, had consequences far beyond personal relationships. They affected the family, the monarchy, and history itself. And yet, for Harry, there was a lingering sense of righteousness, of justification, and even moral clarity. He believed he was doing what was right, protecting his privacy and asserting his independence. But the monarchy is a world where intentions matter less than outcomes. And in this case, the outcomes would soon force a confrontation that no one could ignore. As we move forward, you will see how these secret actions collided with the responsibilities, expectations, and legacy of King Charles III. You will witness the moment when discretion ended, confrontation began, and the consequences became unavoidable. And you will understand why the palace insiders now describe this chapter as the moment when father and son truly became divided, irreparably. But what happened next? The evidence Charles presented, the private confrontations, the revelations that would shock the public, would escalate this crisis to levels no one could have imagined. And the world was about to witness a fracture in the royal family that might never fully heal. What really happens when the head of one of the most iconic institutions in the world approaches the end of life? For Queen Elizabeth II, the answer is far more complicated than the public ever saw. Behind the polished ceremonies, the formal statements, and the dignified appearances lay a web of personal relationships, private tensions, and critical decisions, all of which intersected with the actions of one of her sons, Prince Harry. The final days of the Queen were unlike any in recent history. At nearly a century old, she was frail, yet determined to uphold the traditions she had maintained for decades. Every hour was scheduled, every meeting planned, and every visit orchestrated with precision. The palace moved like a finely tuned machine, ensuring that her legacy, image, and comfort were protected. Yet within that machine, tension simmered. Every deviation, every choice made outside protocol had consequences. And Harry, with his recent secret moves and independent actions, was at the center of it. Sources close to the palace describe a period filled with both reverence and anxiety. The Queen was aware of her mortality, but remained committed to duty. Advisors, aides, and family members worked tirelessly to ensure that she could carry out her responsibilities without added stress. But the palace staff noticed what many outside the walls did not. Prince Harry was increasingly absent at key moments. Phone calls went unanswered, private messages bypassed official channels, and appearances were delayed or canceled at critical times. While the public might see these actions as understandable, grief, personal choice, or logistical conflict, inside the palace, they were interpreted differently. Timing was everything. During these final weeks, every visit by a family member carried symbolic weight. Every decision about who was present at meetings, public appearances, or private consultations was deliberate. Yet Harry's independent actions disrupted that careful balance. He attended some events but skipped others, often without prior notice or explanation. His absence, insiders say, was felt keenly not just by Charles, but by the Queen herself. Though she never publicly criticized her son, private accounts suggest she was aware of the tension and its potential impact on her remaining time. But it wasn't just absence that caused concern. It was also how Harry managed information, in a period when communication was vital. Regarding both ceremonial events and personal family decisions, Harry bypassed palace channels, sending messages to external contacts, journalists, and private advisors. Some of these communications, insiders now reveal, caused confusion about scheduling and intentions. Imagine the Queen's staff juggling her final arrangements while simultaneously trying to reconcile conflicting instructions from a son who believed he was acting in her best interest. It was a high-stakes balancing act, and one that put immense strain on everyone involved. Another element that insiders describe as critical was Harry's engagement with media narratives. During these final days, stories began to surface portraying him as a concerned, grieving son, disconnected but caring. While Harry may have believed he was protecting his reputation and privacy, the public perception created unintended consequences. Advisors worried that media framing could overshadow the Queen's final appearances, dominate headlines, and even influence family dynamics. Every leaked quote or anonymous tip added tension to an already delicate situation. And then there were private family interactions. Charles, William, and other senior royals reportedly tried repeatedly to engage Harry in discussions about protocol, presence, and alignment with the family's plans. But these discussions often stalled. Harry expressed frustration over perceived constraints, a desire for independence, and concerns about public scrutiny. While some family members saw these conversations as honest attempts at communication, others interpreted them as defiance, even disregard. This perception would later fuel some of the most damning criticisms of his behavior. The Queen herself, according to sources, was deeply aware of these dynamics. She valued loyalty and duty above all, but she also understood the complexities of her youngest son's personality. She had witnessed his struggles, his public controversies, and his attempts to navigate life outside the traditional royal mold. In private moments, she reportedly expressed both concern and sorrow, hoping that her family could find unity in her final days. But hope, as it turned out, was insufficient against the unfolding chain of events. The tension peaked during one critical week, where multiple high-profile visits, public engagements, and family meetings were scheduled. The Queen's health required careful timing of these appearances, and her advisors were meticulous in ensuring that everything ran smoothly. Yet Harry's actions complicated the process. Delayed arrivals, uncoordinated statements, and secret communications created confusion and frustration among staff. It was a stark reminder that even the smallest deviations in the royal system can have dramatic consequences. Historians and royal commentators emphasize that this period was unprecedented. Never before had a senior royal acted with such independence during a monarch's final days. While previous heirs had occasional disagreements with their parents, Harry's combination of absence, secrecy, and media involvement was uniquely disruptive. And for Charles, who was poised to step into kingship, it represented both a personal and institutional challenge. He needed to maintain order, protect his mother's legacy, and manage public perception, all while navigating the emotional and relational minefield created by his son's actions. It's also important to consider the emotional context. Harry was not simply absent. He was navigating grief, personal pressure, and the desire for autonomy. He may have believed that his decisions were justified, that he was acting with the Queen's best interests at heart. Yet the optics, the timing, and the unintended consequences created a narrative of recklessness. And in the monarchy, perception is nearly as important as reality. Even the most personal choices are interpreted through a lens of duty, loyalty, and legacy. The unfolding timeline of the Queen's final days shows just how consequential these choices were. Private meetings were rescheduled, aides were forced to mediate communications, and Charles found himself repeatedly intervening to realign the family's actions. One insider recalls a particularly tense meeting where Harry arrived late, citing personal conflicts, only to find that the Queen's carefully orchestrated schedule had been disrupted. Tempers flared, words were exchanged, and the atmosphere became charged with emotion. Even the most experienced palace staff described it as one of the tensest periods they had ever witnessed. And yet, amid all of this, the queen continued her work. She maintained her composure, fulfilled her duties, and managed the complex dynamics of a family at odds. The public saw a serene, unwavering monarch, but behind closed doors, the strain was intense. Every family interaction carried weight. Every absence, every secretive decision, every miscommunication contributed to an undercurrent of tension that would soon erupt into the most publicized royal confrontation in decades. It's also worth noting the ripple effect of Harry's behavior beyond immediate family interactions. Some accounts suggest that other royals, advisors, and staff began adjusting their own actions in response to his secrecy. Trust was affected. Decisions were double-checked. Communications became more formal, cautious, and, at times, strained. A single son's actions, intended or not, were influencing the behavior of an entire institution. In the end, the Queen's final days became a crucible, a moment where personal, familial, and institutional pressures collided. Every choice mattered. Every absence was noted. And in this high-stakes environment, Harry's independent actions, secret communications, and media interactions took on heightened significance. What might have been minor deviations under ordinary circumstances became pivotal moments with lasting consequences. By the time Queen Elizabeth passed, the foundation of the monarchy had been tested in ways few could have anticipated. Charles had observed the ripple effects of Harry's actions, recognized the potential for long-term disruption, and understood that difficult choices were necessary to protect the institution and the family legacy. The stage was set for confrontation, accountability, and decisions that would fundamentally alter the relationship between father and son. And as the world mourned the passing of a beloved monarch, the internal story, the private conflicts, the missed opportunities for reconciliation, and the consequences of independent actions was only beginning to surface. What happens next would define the remainder of Harry's role in the monarchy, and the choices he made during these critical days would come under intense scrutiny. But the confrontations that would follow, the evidence presented by Charles, the private arguments, and the public fallout, would push the rift between father and son into uncharted territory. And when it exploded, no one would be able to ignore the consequences. Have you ever witnessed a confrontation so intense, so layered with emotion, that it feels like history itself is holding its breath? That's exactly what happened when King Charles III finally confronted Prince Harry. This wasn't a casual chat in a drawing room. This was a calculated, high-stakes confrontation, one that insiders now describe as unprecedented in the history of the modern monarchy. The backdrop of this confrontation was already charged. The Queen's final days had revealed fractures, miscommunications, and a pattern of independent actions by Harry that had disrupted the palace. Charles, who had been preparing for his new role as king while managing personal grief, now faced the added burden of addressing his son's choices that were interpreted as reckless, defiant, and damaging to the family and institution he had been entrusted to lead. The meeting itself was private, intense, and meticulously arranged. Senior advisors describe it as formal yet emotional, with Charles determined to address both factual concerns and personal disappointment. Harry, according to multiple accounts, arrived with a mixture of defiance, anxiety, and expectation. He knew a confrontation was coming, but no one could have anticipated the level of intensity that Charles brought to the discussion. Charles opened with evidence. Not accusations, not hearsay, but documented instances of Harry's actions over the previous weeks. Missed appearances, secret communications, unsanctioned meetings, and interactions with media intermediaries. The king laid out timelines, cross-referenced accounts, and presented the consequences of these decisions in stark detail. The weight of the moment was amplified by Charles's calm, yet unflinching tone. This was not an argument. It was a reckoning. For Harry, the experience was jarring. On one hand, he believed he was acting independently, in line with his conscience, and even in the Queen's interest. On the other hand, Charles's meticulous presentation of evidence painted a picture that left little room for interpretation. His actions had caused disruption, confusion, and tension during what should have been a delicate period. Every secret call, every independent move, and every bypass protocol was laid bare. The emotional intensity escalated quickly. Insiders recount that Harry initially responded defensively, insisting that he had only acted with good intentions. He emphasized personal autonomy, privacy, and the pressures of public scrutiny. But Charles, unwavering, reminded him that in the royal context, intentions alone are insufficient. Actions, timing, and consequences mattered, especially when they involved the Queen, the family, and the monarchy itself. One of the most explosive moments of the confrontation occurred when Charles addressed the timing of Harry's absences during key family moments. The king's words reportedly cut through any pretense of neutrality. The delays, missed visits, and secretive moves were not trivial. They had tangible consequences, affecting both the Queen's comfort and the institution's operations. He made it clear that loyalty was not optional, and that defiance during such critical moments could not be tolerated. What made the confrontation even more remarkable was the combination of personal and institutional stakes. Charles did not merely speak as a father confronting a son. He spoke as a king confronting the future of his monarchy. Every word carried dual weight. It was both a reprimand and a statement of authority. He reminded Harry of the responsibilities inherent in being a member of the royal family, the trust placed in him by his mother, and the expectations of the public. This was not simply a conversation about personal grievances. It was about history, legacy, and duty. Harry's reactions were equally complex. At times, he expressed remorse, acknowledging that certain actions may have caused tension. At other times, he asserted his right to autonomy, defending his choices and emphasizing the pressures he faced. It was a clash of perspectives, father and son, tradition and independence, duty and personal freedom. And the tension was palpable, leaving palace staff on edge and insiders describing the room as electrically charged. The confrontation escalated further when Charles presented specific examples of the consequences of Harry's decisions. Miscommunications with senior staff, disrupted schedules, and conflicts with public expectations were all highlighted in meticulous detail. Each example was followed by an explanation of how it affected the Queen's final days and the family's cohesion. The cumulative effect was undeniable. Harry's independent actions had tangible, far-reaching consequences. What makes this showdown even more striking is the psychological complexity. Charles approached the confrontation with a mix of authority, disappointment, and restrained emotion. He was not simply angry. He was strategic, precise, and deliberate. His goal was not public spectacle but clarity, accountability, and correction. For Harry, the experience was simultaneously confronting and humiliating. A stark realization that independence without consideration of context could carry significant consequences. Observers note that the discussion was not without moments of vulnerability. At times, both father and son expressed personal frustration, sorrow, and even grief. Charles reportedly reflected on the pressures Harry faced, the public scrutiny, and the challenges of being in the royal spotlight. Harry, in turn, acknowledged feelings of isolation, misunderstanding, and the desire to define his own path. Yet, despite these emotional undertones, the confrontation maintained its core purpose: accountability. Insiders also emphasized that the confrontation was meticulously documented by senior advisors. Every point raised, every rebuttal offered, and every concession made was noted. The significance of this documentation cannot be overstated. It became a reference point for subsequent decisions, including the unprecedented move to restrict Harry's participation in certain family roles and ultimately his banishment from official royal duties. As the confrontation continued, the stakes rose even higher. Charles, recognizing the broader implications for the monarchy, made it clear that reconciliation was possible only if Harry acknowledged the impact of his actions and aligned with the family's responsibilities. The message was unambiguous. The monarchy's stability and public trust outweighed personal autonomy. It was a historic assertion of authority, and it sent a clear signal not just to Harry, but to the public, staff, and extended royal family. For Harry, the realization was sobering. His independent streak, previously celebrated in some circles as a mark of individuality, was now framed as disruptive, risky, and even harmful. Every choice he had made, every private communication, every unsanctioned meeting was suddenly scrutinized under the harsh light of consequence. The confrontation exposed the tension between intention and outcome, autonomy and responsibility, personal desire and institutional duty. By the end of the meeting, insiders describe a scene of emotional exhaustion, restrained tension, and mutual awareness of the gravity of the situation. Charles had delivered his message clearly, firmly, and strategically. Harry had heard it, processed it, and confronted the reality that his actions had far-reaching consequences. Yet, as with any historic confrontation, the full impact was not immediate. What seemed like a private reckoning was about to spill into public awareness in ways that would shock the world. And the most dramatic moment was yet to come. Because this confrontation, while private, set the stage for the unprecedented step of banishing a senior royal, a move so extraordinary that it would dominate headlines, redefine family relationships, and forever alter the legacy of Prince Harry. What happened next? The evidence made public, the responses from Harry and the media, and the ripple effects within the monarchy would escalate tensions to levels no one could have imagined. And the world was about to witness a royal showdown unlike anything in modern history. Imagine being confronted not only with accusations, but with irrefutable evidence, documents, communications, timelines, and witness accounts that leave no room for interpretation. This is exactly what Prince Harry faced in the days following his historic confrontation with King Charles III. For the first time, the consequences of his actions were no longer theoretical, private, or subject to interpretation. They were concrete, undeniable, and devastating. The evidence, insiders say, came in multiple forms. First were the internal communications, emails, phone records, and notes that documented Harry's independent decisions, his secret meetings, and his unsanctioned media contacts. Every instance showed a pattern of defiance and secrecy that could not be easily explained away. Advisors compiled the information meticulously, creating timelines that highlighted the intersections between Harry's actions and key events during Queen Elizabeth's final weeks. One of the most damning pieces of evidence involved a chain of emails that revealed meetings with outside advisors, individuals with no formal role in the monarchy, during critical moments. These meetings were often scheduled without informing palace staff or coordinating with Charles's directives. While Harry may have believed he was acting discreetly and responsibly, the evidence painted a different picture. A senior royal bypassing protocol, undermining authority, and creating potential disruption at the highest level. Another set of evidence centered around communications with media intermediaries. In the weeks before the Queen's passing, multiple journalists received information about Harry's activities and perspectives, sometimes through back channels or anonymous sources. The palace, upon investigating, traced several of these leaks back to Harry's network of contacts. This was not only a breach of trust, but also a potential risk to the Queen's privacy and the family's public image. The documentation left little doubt. Harry had knowingly and deliberately engaged in actions that compromised protocol. But the most striking evidence was not just in documents or emails. It came in the form of first-hand accounts from palace staff, advisors, and senior family members. Witnesses described instances where Harry's decisions directly conflicted with established schedules, disrupted security arrangements, and caused logistical headaches for staff managing the Queen's final days. Every account corroborated the pattern: independent action, secrecy, and disregard for established procedures. What made the situation even more explosive was the convergence of timelines. By mapping Harry's independent activities against key events during the Queen's final weeks, advisors demonstrated that his actions had real consequences. For example, one unscheduled meeting coincided with a critical family briefing, delaying decision-making and forcing Charles and senior aides to adapt on the fly. Another unauthorized communication with media intermediaries caused confusion among palace staff about who would attend a ceremonial appearance, creating tension and public speculation. It was not just a matter of inconvenience. The evidence suggested that Harry's actions may have indirectly contributed to heightened stress for the Queen and the family. Timing is everything in the royal household, and even minor deviations can ripple outward. Insiders describe moments of near panic as staff scrambled to reconcile Harry's independent moves with the careful orchestration required during the Queen's final days. Financial and administrative documents further complicated Harry's position. Some of his independent projects, philanthropic initiatives, and public statements were executed without the knowledge or approval of senior advisors. While some projects may have been well-intentioned, the lack of coordination created risks, not only to public perception but also to institutional credibility. The evidence suggested a recurring pattern: initiative without alignment, autonomy without accountability, independence without consideration of consequence. The cumulative effect of all this evidence was staggering. For Charles, it painted a clear, unambiguous picture. Harry's choices, while perhaps well-meaning, were reckless, defiant, and incompatible with the responsibilities of a senior royal. For Harry, the realization was equally sobering. The confrontation with his father had been emotional and intense, but the presentation of irrefutable evidence left little room for negotiation, excuse, or reinterpretation. His position within the family and institution was suddenly precarious in a way that could not be reversed. What insiders describe next is almost cinematic. A secure meeting room, advisors on standby, Charles calmly presenting timelines, documents, and first-hand accounts. Harry listens, initially with defensiveness, then with dawning comprehension, as the pattern of his actions is laid bare. Every bypass protocol, every secret meeting, every leak is examined, analyzed, and contextualized. By the end of the session, the message is clear: consequences are inevitable. The impact of this evidence extended beyond the immediate confrontation. Charles and senior advisors began discussing measures to protect the monarchy, the Queen's legacy, and the family's public reputation. Among the options considered was an unprecedented move: restricting Harry's participation in certain royal duties, limiting his public engagement, and ultimately, what insiders describe as banishment from official royal roles. The documentation compiled during this period became the foundation for those decisions, providing both justification and clarity. And yet, even as the evidence mounted, questions lingered. Did Harry understand the full consequences of his actions? Was he intentionally defiant, or simply unaware of how his independent choices would be interpreted? Insiders suggest that a mix of both factors was at play. His desire for autonomy collided with the rigid expectations of royal protocol, producing a perfect storm of misunderstanding and conflict. One particularly striking revelation came from security and logistics reports. During critical moments, Harry's independent movements, uncoordinated appearances, private trips, and secret meetings required the palace to reallocate staff, adjust schedules, and implement last-minute security measures. While these were never publicized, the internal documentation emphasized the seriousness of the situation. In other words, Harry's independence had tangible consequences, not just symbolic ones. As the days unfolded, the evidence only grew more damning. Every document, account, and communication added layers of clarity. Harry's actions were not isolated incidents. They were part of a consistent pattern. Advisors compiled binders of proof, mapped timelines, and cross-referenced reports. The result was a comprehensive dossier that left little doubt. The prince's behavior during the Queen's final weeks had been disruptive, unsanctioned, and incompatible with his expected role. What makes this chapter even more compelling is the human element. While the evidence is factual, it also carries emotional weight. Staff recall moments of exhaustion, tension, and frustration as they navigated the fallout. Charles faced the painful task of holding his son accountable while simultaneously grieving and preparing to ascend the throne. And Harry, confronted with the undeniable facts, had to grapple with the realization that his choices had serious implications for family, legacy, and public perception. The evidence ultimately became the turning point. It was no longer a question of intention versus outcome. It was a matter of accountability. Every detail, every timeline, every witness account reinforced the narrative that Harry's independent actions had consequences beyond his personal sphere. And these consequences would soon manifest in a dramatic and unprecedented decision by the king. But what came next? The moment when Charles acted on the evidence, the private meetings that led to Harry's banishment, and the public revelation that would shock the world would take this story to an entirely new level. And the repercussions of these decisions would echo far beyond the palace walls. Imagine being part of an institution for your entire life, believing in its traditions, its protections, and your place within it, only to be told that your role has been quietly erased. For Prince Harry, that was the stark reality in the weeks following the Queen's passing. The culmination of secret moves, independent actions, and the mountain of evidence presented by King Charles III led to a decision so unprecedented that insiders admit it shocked even senior advisors: a private banishing. It wasn't publicized, at least not at first. There were no formal proclamations, no official ceremonies, no press releases. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated, private decision, executed with both precision and discretion. Charles wanted to maintain the dignity of the institution while also asserting authority and holding Harry accountable. The message was clear: Harry's independence, secrecy, and breaches of protocol had consequences, and those consequences would fundamentally alter his role within the royal family. The process began with a series of private meetings. Charles, accompanied by senior advisors and legal counsel, met with Harry to outline the reality of his position. The tone was firm but measured. There was no public shaming, no humiliation in front of staff, yet the weight of the decision was palpable. Advisors described Charles's approach as a mixture of authority, sorrow, and clarity. He wanted Harry to understand that this was not a punishment for personal reasons, but a necessary step to protect the monarchy and the family legacy. The banishing was multifaceted. First, Harry's participation in official royal duties was suspended indefinitely. Any ceremonial appearances, state events, or public engagements traditionally tied to his position were now off-limits. Invitations to family functions, even those previously assumed as automatic, were curtailed. Essentially, Harry was stripped of the privileges, responsibilities, and visibility that defined a senior royal. Second, his staff and advisors were reassigned. Any team members dedicated to assisting him in royal matters were either integrated into other royal offices or released from duties. This was both a practical and symbolic move. Without staff, Harry's capacity to operate within the institution was diminished, reinforcing the reality of his reduced role. Perhaps most strikingly, communication channels were realigned. Harry's access to internal royal communications, calendars, and sensitive correspondence was restricted. Messages that once flowed freely to and from him were now filtered through Charles and senior advisors. Every unsanctioned move, every independent decision, had created vulnerabilities, and the king was determined to safeguard the integrity of the monarchy moving forward. The emotional impact on Harry was profound. While he had faced confrontations and criticism before, this action struck at the core of his identity. He was no longer merely a prince with personal freedom. He was a member of a family whose authority had decisively curtailed his formal role. Reports indicate a mix of disbelief, anger, and sorrow. He struggled to reconcile his desire for independence with the stark reality that his actions had alienated him from the very institution he had once championed. Insiders note that the private banishing also sent a strong message to the rest of the family and staff. Charles's decision was unprecedented. No senior royal had ever been quietly removed from duties in this manner, and it underscored the principle that loyalty, protocol, and alignment with institutional priorities were non-negotiable. Advisors describe a renewed sense of order and clarity within the palace, a reminder that the monarchy's continuity outweighed individual preference or ambition. Yet, the decision was not without internal controversy. Some aides sympathized with Harry, believing that he had acted out of genuine concern for his family and desire for autonomy. Others argued that the action was necessary to prevent further disruption, protect the Queen's legacy, and preserve public trust. Balancing these perspectives was a delicate task, requiring both discretion and decisiveness. Charles, according to insiders, navigated this with remarkable composure, ensuring that the family's dignity and the monarchy's stability remained intact. The symbolism of the private banishing was also profound. It sent a message not only to Harry but to the public. The monarchy could assert authority over even its most senior members. Actions have consequences. Independence without accountability cannot coexist with tradition. In a world where public perception is everything, the quiet removal of Harry from official duties conveyed strength, decisiveness, and protection of legacy. Of course, the banishing was not total. Harry retained personal titles, some informal connections with family members, and his private life remained largely unaffected in practical terms. But in terms of influence, authority, and visibility within the institution, he was effectively erased. Public appearances, ceremonial roles, and the capacity to act as a senior royal were no longer his domain. The impact of this subtle, yet seismic shift cannot be overstated. There were also logistical consequences. Staff, security, and advisors had to recalibrate operations to accommodate Harry's reduced role. Events were rescheduled, security protocols adjusted, and media management strategies redesigned. Even minor miscommunications could no longer be tolerated, given the high-profile scrutiny surrounding the family. Every detail mattered, and Harry's absence from official duties required meticulous planning to maintain continuity. Emotionally, the decision created ripples throughout the family. Some members were relieved that authority had been asserted and protocols reinforced. Others were concerned about the long-term effects on relationships, both within the family and with the public. A delicate balance had to be maintained between enforcing accountability and preserving the personal bonds that defined family life. Charles, for his part, was acutely aware of this tension. His approach combined firmness with measured empathy, ensuring that the action was understood as a necessary step rather than a personal vendetta. Publicly, the private banishing remained largely under the radar, at least initially.